So, IndyCar is finally gonna get its version of Drive to Survive. Let's talk about that and much more in the cynical world of IndyCar. Okay, let's start off. Unfortunately, we have to start off with a negative because I wanted to and promised that I would expand on IndyCar's engine fiasco. And I'm going to continue to use that word because it has been. And I'm going to lay out exactly kind of how this situation devolved to the point where IndyCar will now continue to use its 2.2 V6 twin turbocharged engine formula, but now they are going to ditch what they were going to originally use, brand new 2.4 liter engines that the manufacturers have already designed, built, and developed. And they're going to stick the hybrid system that they were originally going to put on the 2.4 liter engines, and now I've put them on the 2.2 liter engines. Now, surface level, and frankly, not incorrectly, this was the right move for IndyCar to make. I've said this on the channel several times. I've said it on Twitter several times, and it was confirmed 2 days ago in a really good article that Marshall Pruitt wrote with quotes from David Salters from Honda Performance Development. And that is that the manufacturers were only going to be able to make in the first year with the 2.4 liter engines, regardless of anything else, which we'll talk about here in just a second, they were only going to be able to supply 12 full-time engines each. That meant that IndyCar teams were going to have to find a way to cut back to 24 full-time entries for the full season. And God only knows what that would have meant for the Indianapolis 500. I've mentioned several times, if you go back in history, what happens when a formula change happens and everyone is required to go buy brand new stuff the first year? The Indy 500 entry list, and really the series entry list, takes a nosedive. It always happens. I cannot believe that series higher-ups never account for this or never understand that that's going to happen. Because you look at 1997, while there wasn't necessarily a shortage of teams then because the economy was better, people had more faith in IndyCar racing, even if it was the Indy Racing League, the engines had massive reliability problems. And ultimately, while 35 cars were added to the Indianapolis 500 grid, only about 28 of them actually ended up taking the green flag. 2003, teams had to absolutely scramble. The series had to scramble to fill the field. Ditto 2012, and you had three manufacturers. Sure, Lotus might as well not have been a manufacturer. That accounted for two entries in the 2012 Indianapolis 500, but there was no way in hell there was going to be a bump day that year. And whenever the 2.4 liter engines were going to be used, there was not going to be a bump day. There was going to have to be teams cut out of the entire series, and I guess they probably would have found a way to get to 33, but they would have been pieced together entries. So from the perspective health of the teams and the health of the car counts, and most importantly to me, it's the employment of the people who work on those cars. We want more people involved in racing, not less. We want more people to be able to make a living in racing, not less. So thankfully, at this time, no one's going to lose their jobs because their team couldn't get an engine. That's good. But at the same time, teams are building $100 million facilities. There are multiple teams doing that right now. So, yeah, I don't have a ton of sympathy, especially for the bigger teams. They can certainly afford more expensive engines, but from a smaller team perspective, and let's be honest, the smaller teams were the ones that were going to get shoved out if the manufacturers had to cut down. McLaren was still going to be able to run 3 or 4 cars. Put it that way, right? It just makes sense. Would AJ Foyt even be able to run 2? Would they be allowed to? Would Juncos be able to run 2? Probably not. Would Ed Carpenter be allowed to run 3 or maybe even 4 if Perez shows up? No, they wouldn't. Let's be honest with ourselves. But we shouldn't also stick our heads in the sand and say just because IndyCar ultimately came to a reasonable conclusion that this isn't a major disaster. And people are going to say, and I've seen them say, because they've replied to me on Twitter, they've replied to other people on Twitter, they say it in the YouTube comments, they say it on Facebook, you see it everywhere. Oh, David, the racing's so good. The racing's so good and it makes up for everything. The racing was good in kart in 2001 and 2002. And that series repeatedly shot itself in the foot to the point where it no longer existed. The good racing did not save kart. Okay? And I get that that's a different situation. But to just say the racing's good and nothing else matters, you just do not get it. You just don't. There's more to and unfortunately, I wish it was that pure. I really do. I wish racing, you could sit there and go, the racing's great. That means everything's great. But that is not how this works. Not one bit. So how did we get to this situation? Because there have been, and this is what you guys really need to understand, is that there have been tens of millions of dollars potentially thrown away with this decision. Again, I think it's the right one, but it never should have gotten to the point where the manufacturer spent the amount of money that they have only to just say, oh, we're not using that technology now. So let's go back all the way to the point, it was around 2018, 2019, when IndyCar said, here's our new regulations. And those regulations were for 2.4 liter twin turbocharged V6s. No hybrid. There was no hybrid in the original version of these regulations. They were trying to get a third manufacturer, and as you'll find out, the third manufacturer was the only thing that was going to make the 2.4 liter formula work at all. They thought they had a manufacturer on the hook, and that manufacturer was Porsche. But that manufacturer needed, not just wanted, but needed to sell to its board, hey, we want to go IndyCar racing. They needed some form of electrification. IndyCar said, we're not doing that, we're fast and loud. And Porsche said, sorry, we can't do business with you. And eventually, of course, they ended up building an LMDH car and having that particular car be run by one Roger S. Penske. Well, as it turns out, Porsche wasn't the only manufacturer that wanted electrification. Now, it's unclear, at least to me, which order these events actually took place in. But the facts are that at some point, IndyCar decided to to electrify their cars and add a hybrid. Now, was that because Porsche said no? Or was it because Chevrolet eventually changed their corporate direction and now there's a big old blue EV in the middle of Chevrolet? Chevy needs electrification now. They are now in the same position that Porsche was in 2018, 2019. Chevy requires now for electrification of their race cars to go racing. And if you don't think it's coming to NASCAR, I've got another thing for you. And Honda, I'm not sure where they stand on electrification. There's a lot of people who will come out and claim, oh, Honda doesn't want anything to do with hybrids. That may be true. But ultimately, whether they agreed with enthusiasm or whether they agreed because they wanted to make sure that they were not the sole supplier of IndyCar engines again, Honda said, if Chevy wants hybrids, sure, we'll make a hybrid. So the regulations changed to a 2.4 liter hybrid. Okay, great. Well, then you have COVID hit and all the economic recessions of that. Everything gets pushed back. You get, fast forward to this year. The hybrid systems were a disaster starting out. They were being very argumentative with the 2.4 liter engines. So much so to the point that the teams or the manufacturers tested at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway with the 2.4 liter engines, as they were originally intended to be, running without the hybrids. As spring turned to summer, it became apparent that Chevy, and several credible people have told me this, Chevy could not make their engine attached to the spec hybrid system work on the dyno. To the point where they were literally, I don't want to say explosion because it's not the right word, but they were destroying parts. The engine and the hybrid system with the Chevy would not last on the dyno. They never got that car running on a racetrack with a hybrid. Guess who did? Honda. Honda, on the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, went out there and did a test on the road course with a 2.4 liter engine and a hybrid. So Chevy needed and wanted hybrids. They got it. They couldn't execute. Honda may or may not have wanted hybrids. They executed. They held up their end of the bargain. IndyCar needed a third manufacturer to make the 2.4 liter engines make any sense anyway, because the manufacturers were only going to be able to supply a certain amount of the field, and God only knows how they were going to supply 33 cars to the Indianapolis 500. IndyCar did not secure a third manufacturer. They didn't hold up their end of the bargain. The only ones that held up their end of the bargain in this situation was Honda. And at the end of the day, Honda took and you need to understand this too, a huge amount of the cost of a new engine is all of the development work, R&D, paying people to sit there and develop and test a new engine. It's not necessarily manufacturing. It's not necessarily maintaining those engines. It's R&D. When IndyCar said we're not going to run the 2.4 liter engines, Honda, who did their homework, got a car on track, had to throw all of that investment out. And so when they are saying very spicy things to Marshall Pruitt at Racer, that worries me, because Honda did everything they needed to do, and the rules got changed, and they're pissed. Rightfully so. Rightfully so. And I've been critical of Honda in the past. Are they right 100% of the time? No. Are they right in this situation? Do they have a right to be pissed? Absolutely. Honda has never left IndyCar racing since they joined in 1994. And you guys are going to, or some of you are going to say that this is not a big situation. Some of you are going to say that, oh, well, Honda having to throw that motor out, it's not a big deal. This is fine. Everything's fine. The racing is great. No, this is something that is significant. Significant. If nothing changes. Now, that being said, a lot more eyeballs would solve a lot of problems. And that's what we're going to talk about here in just a second. But I'll leave this little bit of a nugget for you guys. Because the hybrid systems are going to have to be added to the current power plants, and the current power plants are pretty tightly packed inside of the current body kits. My understanding is, and again, got it from really solid sources, not expecting this to change. There's going to be a new body kit. Don't know how much of a significant change it's going to be, but there is going to be a new body kit in 2024. So if you're a fan of change, you're going to get a breadcrumb in 2024. Don't know how you feel about that, but at least maybe the marketing budget's going to be higher. Yes, that's right. From our pal Adam Stern at the Sports Business Journal. Sorry, Adam. Great article coming out today where there's some key quotes from Penske Corp executives saying they're going to significantly increase their investment in marketing plans, including new ad campaigns, content partnerships, unscripted docuseries, which we'll talk about in just a second, a national PR and earned media effort, a new app, and other digital efforts, influencer and sustainability strategies. Okay, now we get to be a little bit more positive in this video, because this is exactly, and I'm not saying they listen to me, they don't listen to me, no. But I'm so glad that they saw what I saw. And I said when the previous head of marketing got let go, I said, the only way that the next person, whoever that is going to have any success is if they are armed with a proper budget. And this is exactly what it sounds like they're doing. So that encourages me just a little bit and says to me, they do see what we are seeing. And if they are, then I'm cautiously optimistic. I'm cautiously optimistic as well about the new TV show. And it's called 100 Days to Indy. It's going to be a collaboration between the CW TV network, Vice, and Penske Entertainment. It's going to be 6 parts, and it's going to lead up to the 2023 Indianapolis 500. So a quick turnover. So really, this all seems pretty good. And I think the first positive I'm going to say is it is not on Peacock. It's not on Peacock. Because I think so many of us were worried that if the documentary, The Drive to Survive, whatever you want to call it, they were going to put it on Peacock and no one was going to be able to see it. So at the very least, this is going out on a real TV network. It's going to be streamed and syndicated on Vice and Vice TV. From that perspective, positive. Thumbs up. Job one done. Now for the criticism. Because I think that, again, my first impression was awesome. They did get it done. It's not some Peacock exclusive. This has potential to actually be seen by people who are not just IndyCar fans. Because if this just goes out to IndyCar, that was the problem with the NASCAR one, the race for the championship. It was just playing on USA Network, where people watch wrestling and watch NASCAR. Oh, those are one and the same. Like, it's the same demographic. On the CW, well, at least initially I thought you're at least kind of going out to like fangirl teeny boppers who watch Supergirl, right? Well, not necessarily. There's an article out there, actually a couple articles, that say the CW's average viewership age is 58 years old. Uh-oh. There's negative number one. Because the demographics were going to be the biggest part of this show. And at least on the CW, that's IndyCar's demographic. I would also say that I'm a little bit not necessarily concerned. Because I think it's probably the right call at the end of the day. But the fact that the climax of this series is going to be the Indy 500, not the championship, you're building to something that's already built. It's not necessarily trying to build something that hasn't been built yet. It feels very like IRL 1996, unfortunately. It's like the Indy 500 is the biggest thing. Well, we already knew that. And I think a lot of America already knows that the Indy 500 is a big thing. That's why their TV rating, the Indy 500's TV ratings are like 3 or 4 times bigger than the rest of the series. Okay, so that's a problem. Not a problem, but a concern of mine. I think that if the series focuses too much on the Indy 500, then it's going to defeat the purpose of having an IndyCar show. You should just do an Indy 500 show. I hope I'm proven wrong on that, by the way. That's just how it seems to be pitched to me at the moment. Vice, I think, is the most interesting part of this. Because I'll start with a positive. They do very entertaining documentaries. I watch them every now and then. Not a lot, but I do watch them. They do a very good job, and I think they appeal to a younger audience. Vice does. Not necessarily CW based on the numbers. But I think from that perspective, I think Vice, especially depending on how much they're involved, and that's going to be a positive or a negative, and I'll talk about that in just a second, what the negative is. But I think from a positive perspective, I think Vice is going to bring an ability to show IndyCar in a younger light, which the series desperately needs. And they might actually be able to set the tone for whatever the marketing's going to be going forward. Now, that being said, I have watched a lot of Vice content, and it is entertaining, and it is interesting, and I do like it. But it does typically, and this is not a political statement, this is just my interpretation when I watch a Vice thing. It's very, I would describe it as left-wing cynicism. That's generally the angle that they take with their documentaries. Which is to say that one of the worries I see with Vice, there's positives with Vice, which is they appeal to a younger audience. I think they're cool, and I think they do very good documentaries. But I'm worried they're going to take the cynical approach with IndyCar, and they're going to say, this is a sport run by 70-year-old white men, and they run internal combustion engine cars, and yeah, it's kind of dopey. Let's treat it like that. So from that perspective, and I'm glad Penske Entertainment is involved in this, because I hope they can tone some of that down. Because it's not that you want to ignore that. What you want to do is try to change that, right? So that's, I think, why you bring in Vice. You don't want them just pointing out and saying, these are the problems with it. You want them to show how you change those problems. If you understand. Because I watch a lot of their wrestling stuff. And yes, wrestling's fake, right? But a lot of the behind the scenes stories are real. But that angle is always cynical. It's always, Vince McMahon's this horrible bad guy. And they're not necessarily wrong, by the way. But it's always like that. And I hope that the IndyCar documentary, I'm not saying they shouldn't build up villains, but they need to be very careful about not presenting the sport in a positive light. At the end of the day, what Penske Entertainment wants is, you don't want people to be a fan of the show and not the series. Because I think that's where a lot of their wrestling documentaries end up going. People are like, I love watching wrestling documentaries, but you couldn't pay me to turn on a WWE show, right? You don't want that to be the end result of a Vice documentary on the CW. So that's where I guess my left-wing cynicism comment is. That's generally what ends up happening, is people love the documentaries, but they love to hate the subject matter of said documentary. So that's what they need to avoid. I also found an interesting connection, and that is Sean Compton, who is the president of Next Star Networks that recently bought the CW. And in fact, Sean Compton, as far as I know, is one of the biggest proponents of bringing this series onto the CW. And at least based on an Indy Star article about this, is like gung-ho. He's like, we're going to promote it, we're going to promote it, we're going to promote it. Great. Fantastic, Sean. But Sean's actually a Hoosier, apparently been to the Indy 500 before. And something I found very interesting is there was a media company that started covering the Indy 500 around 2021 and 2022 that I saw YouTube clips, and I was like, what the hell is News Nation? Well, as it turns out, News Nation is a passion project by this Sean Compton guy when he got to take over CW. And the good news is the guy's passionate enough about the Indy 500 to tell his news network to show up to the Indy 500 and cover it. So I think that's a positive to look at, is the guy in charge seems to have an active interest and investment in this sport. But it's not going to be a magic bullet. And thankfully, again, Indy Star article had a quote from Mark Miles that said, yeah, we're not expecting this to be a magic bullet. Great. Fantastic. Again, starting to think we're on the same page, and I'm liking that. But it has to be looked at as a building block. Because, quite frankly, IndyCar does not have a lot of blocks to build up a decent-looking house. I think it's got the potential. IndyCar could build a beautiful house. But to think that this documentary series, or to put the faith in the documentary series, or throw all of these new marketing dollars behind the TV series would be a massive mistake. Because if you put all your eggs in that basket, which thankfully it doesn't seem like they're going to do, which is a thumbs up for me, it would be a disaster. Because if the show flops and you've got all your eggs in that basket, you're just going to get discouraged, and you're never going to do anything else marketing-wise again. But I think if you invest in social media, I think if you actively work on your side to build up marketing strategies, content, social media, all that great stuff, and then also have a TV series, and then also get a video game that isn't developed by a company that's just fired all their CEOs, that would be great. That would be great. And I think there's a potential to get it there. And also, you don't want to shoot yourself in the foot about engines. I mean, to be fair, to be 100% fair. But at the end of the day, I'm more positive than I am negative about the TV show. And I would classify that as a win for IndyCar. Now, once again, this entire video is, and it's way too long winded again. I'm sorry, but it goes back to what I talked about in my IndyCar needs to change video, or whatever the hell I called that. This is still a 7-9 sports team because I talked about some positives and I talked about a couple of big negatives. But hopefully, the steps are actually being made now to start having the wins outweigh the negatives, the losses. And that seems to be where it's headed. So this is long-winded. I hope I got all this out. I hope you guys enjoyed listening to me. Again, starting to think I'm going to have to fire up that podcast, eh? So, thank you guys. This has been David Land on YouTube. Subscribe for more motorsport content because there probably going to be a lot more. And I'll see you in the next video.